The evening my husband asked me to look after his nephew James turned out to be one of profound self-discovery, challenging my understanding of relationships, trust, and my own emotions. It began as the setting sun cast a warm, orange glow over the city, the kind of serene scene that usually brought me comfort. But that evening, I felt unsettled. Robert, my husband, had left earlier for a weekend work retreat. His absences weren't unusual, yet this time felt different, perhaps because of his words before leaving. "Evelyn," he said, lingering as he kissed my cheek goodbye, "keep an eye on James while I'm gone. He's still finding his footing. Make sure he feels at home." James, just 19 and fresh out of high school, had been staying with us to transition into city life before starting college. His arrival was marked by a mix of shyness and gratitude that made him endearing. Robert's insistence on helping James settle in felt natural. After all, family supports family. Yet, that evening, as I stood alone in the living room, the house seemed quieter, heavier, as if something was shifting in its energy. James emerged from his room shortly after, a book in hand, and a tentative smile on his face. "Hi, Evelyn," he greeted, his tone polite but uncertain. We exchanged a few words about his day, mundane details about a trip to the bookstore and a stroll through the nearby park. But there was an underlying awkwardness, as if neither of us knew quite how to navigate the space we now shared. After dinner, I suggested we watch a movie. James's face lit up at the idea, and his youthful enthusiasm was infectious. We settled on a classic, one of those timeless films that elicits both laughter and tears. The living room transformed into a cocoon of shared moments, the walls echoing with our laughter and the occasional sniffle during poignant scenes. Yet, amidst the camaraderie, I couldn't shake the sense of being on edge, as if I were observing myself from a distance, analyzing every interaction. It was during one of the quieter moments in the film that James turned to me, his eyes earnest. "Evelyn, do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" The question caught me off guard, piercing through the carefully constructed facade of my contentment. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Sometimes," I admitted finally.
Why?
"Do you ask?" He shrugged, his gaze shifting to the flickering screen. "I guess I'm just trying to figure things out. It's like, I'm not sure who I'm supposed to be yet." His vulnerability struck a chord within me. At 19, he was grappling with questions I'd long since buried beneath the layers of adulthood. But his words lingered, intertwining with my own unspoken doubts and fears. Was I truly content with the life I was living? Or had I settled into a role that felt more like an obligation than a choice? As the night wore on, our conversation deepened, touching on topics both trivial and profound. James's perspective, raw, unfiltered, and unburdened by years of conformity, challenged me to re-examine my own beliefs. His youthful optimism contrasted sharply with the cynicism I hadn't realized I'd developed. By the time we said goodnight, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and renewal, as if our dialogue had unearthed a part of me I'd forgotten existed. That evening, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but reflect on the subtle but significant shift in my perspective. James's simple yet profound question had sparked an internal dialogue I knew I couldn't ignore. In the quiet solitude of the night, I resolved to confront the truths I'd been avoiding, to seek clarity and authenticity in my relationships, and to rediscover the passions that once defined me. The weekend passed, and Robert returned home, his presence restoring the familiar rhythm of our lives. But I was no longer the same. That night of self-discovery had planted a seed of change within me, one that I knew would continue to grow in the days and weeks to come. And though the path ahead was uncertain, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to embrace the journey of finding myself again. At 7, the familiar creak of the old wooden stairs echoed through the house, breaking my scattered thoughts. I looked up just in time to see James standing in the doorway. His tousled dark hair and casual hoodie framed a face that still held the softness of youth, but hinted at the confidence of someone finding his footing in the world. He gave me a warm, easy smile. "Hey, Auntie Evelyn," he greeted, his voice soft yet steady, carrying that distinct mix of affection and casualness only he could manage. "Hey, James," I replied, Closing the book I had been half-heartedly flipping through. Truthfully, I'd been pretending to read, lost in my thoughts. How's it going? Not bad, he said as he eased onto the couch opposite me. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though he carried the weight of time lightly. Uncle Robert mentioned you'd be around all weekend. He didn't want you to feel abandoned, I teased lightly, letting a small smile play on my lips. James chuckled, the sound low and genuine. He worries too much. I'm fine, really. We let the conversation trail off into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't demand filling. It was a quiet rhythm that felt natural, the shared presence of two people who didn't need constant words to connect. After a while, I glanced at him and asked, "Hungry?" He shifted upright, his expression brightening. "Yeah, actually. What's for dinner?" We deliberated briefly before settling on pasta with a simple homemade sauce. As we moved into the kitchen, James volunteered to help, much to my surprise. It wasn't long before we found an easy rhythm, working side by side in the warmly lit space. I couldn't help but notice how deftly he handled the tasks I handed him. He chopped vegetables with precision, his hands steady and sure, his focus unwavering. "You're pretty good at this," I remarked, watching him dice the tomatoes with a practiced efficiency that felt unexpected. He glanced up, a teasing grin spreading across his face. "And you're not as bad as I thought you'd be. Honestly, I figured you might burn water." I laughed, the sound bubbling up unexpectedly, genuine and unrestrained. "Well, I guess I've just exceeded expectations." Cooking together felt like a kind of dance, a quiet, unspoken choreography of passing utensils, stirring pots, and sharing brief, amused glances. It wasn't just about the meal, it was about the connection that grew with each shared moment. When the pasta was ready, we set the table, the warm glow of the overhead light casting soft shadows across the room. Seated across from each other, conversation began to flow naturally. We talked about his college aspirations, life in the city, and amusing stories involving Robert that had us both laughing until tears threatened to spill. His voice carried a quiet confidence that belied his age, and as he spoke, his words revealed a depth of thought and clarity that left me impressed. "You've grown up so much," I said, almost to myself, as I watched him animatedly recount a story about one of his professors. He smiled, a touch of shyness flickering across his face. "I guess I've had good role models." The warmth in his words stayed with me, settling in the quiet spaces of my heart. There, at the dining table, under the glow of soft light, surrounded by the lingering aroma of a meal made together, I felt a rare, profound connection. James, so earnest, so full of potential, reminded me of the beauty in shared moments, the small acts that tether us to each other in meaningful ways. As we cleared the table and packed away the leftovers, I realized something. Tonight wasn't just about dinner. It was about building a bridge across generations, about recognizing the quiet strength in showing up for one another, and about cherishing the simplicity of being present. For me, it was a reminder of how powerful these evenings of connection could be. Dinner had been a lively affair, filled with laughter and stories that danced between the present and the past. Plates were cleared, and the clinking of silverware gave way to the softer hum of the evening. Afterward, we drifted back to the living room, where the world seemed to shrink into the warm glow of a single lamp. James settled onto the couch with an easy grace, sprawling in a way that suggested both comfort and confidence. His shoulders relaxed against the cushions, his legs stretched out as if claiming the space without a second thought. I took the armchair opposite him, nursing the remnants of a lukewarm cup of tea. The conversation meandered at first, circling around familiar topics: work, the weather, shared acquaintances. But then, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle, like the first blush of dawn breaking through the dark. The dynamic between us, once neatly defined as host and guest, began to blur. The invisible boundary of polite discourse softened, replaced by something less structured, more intimate. It wasn't uncomfortable, nor was it charged with tension. Instead, It felt like the quiet recognition of a deeper connection, unexpected yet oddly fitting. James leaned forward slightly, his expression open, his voice dropping to a tone that invited trust. He began to share, not the polished anecdotes of a dinner guest, but fragments of his inner world. He spoke of feeling out of place, like a puzzle piece shuffled into the wrong box. He described the disorientation of stepping into a new chapter of life, the kind where the pages feel unwritten and the plotline uncertain. As he spoke, I felt a familiar tug within myself, a resonance I hadn't expected. His words unlocked memories I hadn't revisited in years, my own younger self, fumbling through the haze of self-doubt and the weight of uncharted possibilities. I started sharing, too, not as a mentor or a host, but as someone who had walked a similar path. I told him about the times I'd questioned my choices, the fear of failure that loomed like a shadow, and the small but significant moments that had eventually lit my way forward. The room felt different now, grounded in the candor of our exchange. There was no need to fill the silences that occasionally stretched between us. They felt purposeful, like spaces carved out for reflection. Our stories wove together in a tapestry of shared humanity, bridging the gap between two people at different stages of life, but bound by the same undercurrent of longing, growth, and self-discovery. By the time the conversation wound down, it felt as though we had traversed a great distance, not physically, but emotionally. James leaned back again, his posture relaxed, but his eyes thoughtful. I could sense that something had shifted for him, just as it had for me. We hadn't solved any grand mysteries or arrived at definitive answers, but we had found something equally valuable, the comfort of being understood. As he stood to leave, he smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that carried with it the weight of the evening's exchange. I returned it, feeling an unfamiliar lightness. The subtle shift lingered as he walked out the door, not a conclusion but a quiet reminder of the shared journey that makes us human. As the night deepened, the house gradually surrendered to silence, its rhythm slowing to a soft hum. The warmth of James's steady voice and the understated weight of his words lingered in my thoughts like the faint scent of rain after a storm. His presence hadn't felt inappropriate, nor had it hinted at romance. Instead, it had tapped into something profoundly human, the need to be seen, truly seen and understood without judgment. Standing by the window, the faint glow of the city lights stretched across the horizon like whispers of lives unfolding. The cool glass beneath my fingertips grounded me as my thoughts wandered through the events of the evening. It wasn't James himself who had left an imprint, but what he had unknowingly reflected back at me, my own loneliness, my quiet yearning to be heard. It was in that moment of introspection that clarity emerged. I began to confront a truth I'd been tiptoeing around for years, the quiet distance that had settled between Robert and me. Ours was not a marriage fraught with anger or unhappiness. It was something subtler, a slow erosion of connection that neither of us had dared to name. I couldn't pinpoint when the gaps began to form. Maybe it was in the busyness of life, the daily routines that demanded so much yet asked so little of our souls. Or perhaps it was in the silence that followed small disagreements that were easier left unresolved. Whatever the cause, the evening with James had served as a mirror, reflecting not only my feelings but also the spaces where love once flowed effortlessly. James, in his quiet way, had unknowingly held up that mirror. He hadn't solved anything. He had simply reminded me of what it felt like to be heard, to share a moment of unguarded authenticity. It wasn't a comparison to Robert, nor was it a longing for something new. It was a reminder of the vulnerability I'd once shared with my husband, a reminder of the connection we had somehow misplaced. As the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and silver, I took a deep breath. The evening had been unexpected, yes, but perhaps it was necessary. It had opened a door within me when I could no longer keep closed. Tomorrow wouldn't bring instant change, but it would bring the opportunity to start again, to speak, to listen, and to bridge the unspoken gaps before they became unbridgeable. I stepped away from the window, the warmth of resolve replacing the coolness of the glass. It was time to rediscover the courage to connect, not just with Robert, but with myself. It wasn't about fixing something broken. It was about nurturing something worth saving. And for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to try. The morning sunlight poured into the kitchen as I walked in, drawn by the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. There he was, James, already seated at the counter, a mug cradled in his hands. His tousled hair and unguarded demeanor gave him an almost boyish look, a stark contrast to the intensity of the previous evening. "Morning," he greeted, his voice warm and calm, accompanied by a small, genuine smile. "Morning," I replied, reaching for a cup. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, almost companionable, like the air between us had shifted, cleared of the unspoken tension that had lingered before. James broke the quiet, his tone soft but sincere. "You okay?" I paused, meeting his eyes. There was a tenderness there, a willingness to listen without judgment. "I am," I said with a small nod. "Are you?" He hesitated, as if weighing the truth of his answer, then smiled.
Yeah.
"I think so." We didn't say much else, but the quiet moments we shared felt like an unspoken agreement, a mutual understanding that neither of us had to carry the weight of explanations. We went about the morning in an easy rhythm, the kind that comes when two people stop resisting the natural flow of things. As the day unfolded, I found myself reflecting on what had transpired. That evening with James had been more than a simple encounter. It had been a mirror, revealing not only his vulnerabilities, but my own. It wasn't just about what we had shared. It was about what it illuminated in me. The gaps, the unresolved questions, the truths I had avoided confronting. When Robert returned later that week, I knew what I had to do. The decision wasn't about James. It was about us, Robert and me. James's presence in my life had been an unexpected catalyst, a reminder that relationships require effort, attention, and above all, honesty. I couldn't let the comfort of familiarity become an excuse for neglect. I resolved to have a real conversation with Robert, not one filled with surface-level assurances, but one rooted in truth. I wanted to talk about where we were, where we had drifted, and where we needed to go. It wasn't about placing blame or unearthing old grievances. It was about finding clarity, together. James had taught me something I hadn't even realized I needed to learn: the importance of being present, of addressing the things I had left unspoken for too long. He had reminded me that growth isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes, it's found in quiet moments of self-awareness and the courage to take small but meaningful steps forward. That evening, as I sat across from Robert, I felt ready, not to rebuild, not to fix, but to begin again, with clarity and intention. In the days that followed, the house seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for far too long. The air felt lighter, freer, as if the unspoken tensions had dissolved into whispers of understanding. Sunlight poured through the windows differently now, illuminating corners that once seemed shrouded in shadow. Each day, I approached life with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to nurture the connections that mattered most, both with Robert and, perhaps more importantly, with myself. James, in his quiet and unassuming way, had done more than just spark a moment of reflection. He had unwittingly ignited a journey of self-discovery, one that forced me to examine the narratives I had been clinging to. Through his perspective, I began to see the spaces in my life where growth was not only possible, but necessary. It wasn't a grand epiphany, nor was it about dramatic revelations. It was the gentle unfolding of a truth I had long resisted: that relationships, whether with others or with oneself, are living, breathing entities that require care, attention, and, above all, honesty. Life, as I have come to understand, is punctuated by moments that challenge us, moments that force us to confront the gaps between who we are and who we wish to be. That night, though painful in its rawness, was one of those defining moments. It wasn't about crossing lines or breaking trust. It was about recognizing the quiet spaces where understanding had been missing. It was about acknowledging the unspoken truths that had lingered, the emotional undercurrents that needed to be surfaced and addressed. Moving forward was not a simple act of turning the page, but a deliberate choice to live with greater clarity and authenticity. Gratitude became my compass, guiding me to appreciate the lessons hidden within discomfort. Clarity became my anchor, helping me see not just what needed to change, but also what was worth holding on to. And authenticity became my guiding light, reminding me that living fully means embracing both the beauty and the imperfections of our shared humanity. As I walked through this new chapter, I found myself becoming braver, more willing to have the conversations I once avoided. I leaned into the discomfort of vulnerability, discovering that it held a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The connections I had with Robert deepened, no longer weighed down by the barriers of miscommunication or unspoken fears. And the relationship I cultivated with myself grew richer, rooted in self-compassion and the courage to be fully seen. That night was a turning point, not because it offered easy answers, but because it opened a door to questions I needed to ask. It was a reminder that growth is not a destination but a journey, a continuous process of learning, unlearning, and relearning. And for that, I am grateful.